Stephanie Good is the first speaker, and she's with the Tyendinaga Support Committee. Stephanie is a well-known activist in Toronto circles and has been very committed to a variety of questions. But today she's going to be speaking from her involvement in the Tyendinaga Support Committee, which has been formed to deal with issues around the charges that Sean Brandt is currently facing, and the issue of stolen land in relation to the Mohawks of Tyendinaga. So, Stephanie, do you want to begin?
I want to start my talking by acknowledging that we are on the land of the Mississauga of the New Credit, and just to be aware of that fact that those are the original people and holders of the territory that we're all sitting on right now. I want to thank the sponsors of this event. It's a rare opportunity for the support committee and often for Indigenous issues to be able to access spaces such as this one, so a big thank you on behalf of us. And just to give you a sense of what the support committee is, we formed last year and are made up of supporters and allies. We believe that because we live on and profit from stolen land just through our mere existence, that we have a very serious responsibility to understand the struggle of Indigenous people, and in particular because of relationships and connections and shared commitment, the struggle in Tyendinaga, to support that community and also to participate in the fight for Sean Brandt's freedom. We feel that if we sit back and allow the continued theft and plunder of Mohawk land and allow the Canadian state to criminalize, imprison, marginalize Sean in the fashion that they're attempting to do, we also are participating in an ongoing war against the original people of this land. And we also believe that our struggles in our own lives, in our own circles, in our workplaces, in our communities against poverty and oppression and injustice will never ever be complete without us all actively working towards decolonization. So that's the place that the support committee comes from, and that's how we are here today. When I prepared this talk and when we were invited to this panel, I had no idea that I would be able to begin the talk by issuing a hearty congratulations, and many of the people are actually in this room, to the delegates of the Canadian Union of Public Employees. At the Ontario Convention last week, QP passed a critical resolution, Resolution 38, in support of Indigenous struggle for the land, but in particular against the criminalization of Indigenous resistance and in support of the Mohawks of Tyendinaga and spokesperson Sean Brandt. So a huge congratulations to QP for that. And I'm going to spend some time talking about why exactly that is such a critical thing, and why also it's up to all of us to ensure that that resolution is actually as meaningful as it possibly can be. We're talking about a time when Indigenous people are being criminalized and incarcerated for defending and protecting their traditional territories. Clearly that's not a situation that is limited to Sean and to other Mohawks from his community. Right now there's a big event taking place on the lawn of Queen's Park to highlight the fact that 6 band councillors from the KI community, Big Trout Lake in the far north of Ontario, have been incarcerated, are briefly out for a period of 5 days. They go back to court tomorrow morning and face continued incarceration for their resistance to exploration on their territory. Bob Lovelace, a leader from Ardok Algonquin First Nations, is currently on hunger strike in solitary in a prison for standing up against uranium mine exploration in his community. And in Tyendinaga, there are 3 Mohawks who are currently imprisoned in maximum security conditions. Sean actually just this afternoon got put into a 22-hour-a-day lockdown for burning sage in his cell. And there are 16 people in total charged in the community of Tyendinaga. This is obviously happening in a context that should be familiar to all of us living in this country. We live in a country that's founded and based and makes its riches off of resource extraction, and there are rules to protect that wealth, and those do not look kindly upon Indigenous people who don't profit from that kind of development, whether it's resource extraction or whether it's another form of development that's very common in the south of this province, and that's very particular to Tyndonega as well as Six Nations, which is development in the form of subdivisions, housing projects, and that sort of thing. So in this province, we have things like an Archaic Mining Act that states that no one has the right to say no to mining. In Ontario also we have ministries that issue licenses for resource extraction, even in situations where Indigenous people have claim to that territory, and that's what's happened in Tyndonega as well. Obviously, on a federal level, if we, any of us have forgotten, Canada has a horrific track record on First Nations issues. Over 800 backlogged land claims in a country that's built on stolen land, an Indian reservation system that was used as a model for South African apartheid, staggering employment on and off reserves. 75% of reserves in this country, including Tyndonega, do not have clean drinking water. Suicide rate amongst First Nations youth that is one of the highest in the world. And Canada is now one of 3. It was originally 4 countries, but the government in Australia has changed. So now Canada is one of 3 nations that has refused to sign on to the UN Declaration for Indigenous Rights. So there's a time-honored tradition for refusing to take responsibility for the debt that Canada and we, the Canadian public, owe to First Nations people. I'm not going to go back into deep history of the territory. If people have questions about that, we can talk about it later, but it's a familiar pattern. Over 100 years ago, more than 74,000 acres of land were stolen from the Mohawks. The specific issue that's led to the recent blockades and Sean's arrest is that the federal government finally accepted a claim for 923 acres of that 74,000 acres of stolen land and recognized that it was actually land that belonged to the Mohawks. That piece of land is called the Culbertson Tract. And even though they acknowledge that it rightfully belongs to the community, they've been stalling at the negotiation table since 1995. So we're in 2008 now, and this is a very familiar pattern for anybody that comes from communities like that or is aware of those issues. Those processes don't work quickly. And to add insult to injury, like I mentioned before, the provincial government continues to renew a license for resource extraction. So in Tyndonega in particular, tens of thousands of tons of stolen land literally was being trucked out of the community in the form of a gravel mine. This is part of that 923 acres that the government had already said, yes, it's yours, but we have to figure out how to give it back to you, and we're going to take our sweet time in figuring out how to do that. And the province, in the meantime, makes money, and a non-native business makes money off of literally trucking that land away. So, in the face of this situation, which is obviously completely abhorrent and an insult to the Mohawks of the community, they took, just like a union, they took economic action to pressure the government to resolve the grievances. While the Mohawks can't strike when all else fails, blocking rail lines and highways is a tactic that countless First Nations communities have used to force governments to deal with them honorably. And obviously the issues at hand were far too serious for people to just allow to continue. So about a decade after the Days of Action, in November of 2006, the Mohawk community of Tyndonega, again in response to unresolved land claims, polluted drinking water, overwhelming poverty, and suicides in all First Nations communities, launched a campaign very similar to the Days of Action. They announced a plan of rotating economic disruption, which began with disrupting the plans of a local developer to come and build luxury subdivision homes on the Bay of Quinte, again on the Culbertson Tract, this piece of land that the feds have said already belongs to the Mohawks. So they did a highway picket, and the developer backed off. That was November 2006. About 4 months later, the Mohawks reclaimed the quarry site. So that was the location where the stolen land was being trucked out beneath their eyes. And a month later, around that quarry reclamation, they closed the CN main line for 30 hours. And on the National Day of Action, about 2 months after that, the CN Mainline Highway 2 and Highway 401 were simultaneously targeted and closed for a 24-hour period. And the message resonated. A year ago, in the lead up to the National Day of Action on Aboriginal issues, there was an Angus Reid poll taken showing 71% of Canadians wanted action on land claims, and 41% of Ontarians were prepared to acknowledge that rail blockades were justified, given the current landscape. So that's the context in which the community took those actions. And following both of those actions, Sean alone was charged in connection to actions that were taken by his entire community. He was charged on 9 counts of mischief, and the Ottawa Crown, who's handling his case, offered him a deal, which he refused, of 12 years in federal penitentiary if he didn't want to go to trial. Since that time, so that's last summer, Sean did 2 months in pretrial custody and was released on very strict conditions not to protest, not to attend at the quarry, not to leave the province, and lived on a curfew with his family. He abided by those conditions, and the quarry continued to be held by the community and has become a source of pride for obvious reasons. At the same time, the longhouse that Sean and other people who are related to him in the community have made a longhouse on the territory, a very vibrant space of community organizing. A youth council has been formed for the first time in decades, and the youth have taught themselves traditional songs and have organized around holding the quarry out of that space. Which brings us to about a month ago. So this is sort of how things have been since last summer and those actions were taken. A month ago, again, a developer threatened to lay a shovel in the Culbertson tract, and again, the community responded by closing roads. The developer backed down, but the OPP in this particular situation escalated the confrontation in a very serious way. They blocked off the quarry and held it hostage for 4 days, pulled their weapons on the Mohawks of Tyendinaga, and in the lead up to this whole showdown, 5 Mohawk men were arrested, Sean included. Sean for his involvement in a racist incident where he was protecting 2 Mohawk women and their 10-year-old child from an onslaught by a local Deserano man. So in the wake of the recent activities, and I can talk about them in more detail after, it's complicated to try to cram it in, there are now 16 people charged for defending the quarry, defending this piece of the Culbertson tract, and 3 of those men, including Sean, now remain in jail. I want to, again, sort of emphasize the days of action and the kind of language that was used during the days of action. Sid Ryan, president of Ontario Division of CUPE, said at the time, "We can't have passive resistance. We have to send a strong message to Mike Harris and the business community that if they want to change the social network, it's going to be one hell of a fight. The transportation is going to be shut down, likewise GO trains. There's going to be chaos in the highways." United Steelworkers representative Carol Egan described the days of action as only one battle. We haven't won the war. And Sid Ryan also warned at the time, if we don't see the language, if we don't see the promised changes, in 48 hours we'll be calling a province-wide strike. During the days of action, I'm sure you're all aware, the kind of economic disruption that happened in Toronto alone with the shutting down of the TTC, postal workers doing a slowdown of mail sorting, Pearson International canceling flights and activity there being disrupted. The cost of that economic disruption far surpasses the cost of June 29th and April 30th in Tyendinaga Mohawk territory last year, and no labor leader was ever jailed, let alone charged. So we have to wonder and we have to ask ourselves about this difference in the response of the state. It's not surprising that people in Tyendinaga tell me that the message appears to be that if you're Indian, somehow your grievances don't warrant the same respect or attention and you are to suffer in silence. And if you don't, something like a 12-year deal in a federal penitentiary and that kind of time away from 3 small children is something that should be reasonable. It's up to us, all of us in this room, all of us that are part of social justice organizing, labor organizing, anti-poverty and migrant justice organizing, not to allow this example to be set. It sets a very dangerous precedent for Sean and his community to be isolated and targeted in this fashion. And so I came here on behest of the support committee today to say that we can't allow it, and that there are things that people can do. CUPE has taken a major step forward in showing that we have to make that resolution mean something. So endorse the demands of the campaign, send letters to the AG from your local as a shop steward, take on getting a resolution passed even within your own local, invite people to do educational work within your workspaces. But the hypocrisy of allowing that kind of punishment to come down on Indigenous leaders, whether that's the KI6, RDOC, or Tyndonega, is one that we can't, and the consequences of which are ones that we will have to live with. And we firmly believe that colonization and the system, the way that it's built as it is now, cannot be dismantled without the full and free participation of Indigenous communities at the forefront of that struggle. Thanks.
Okay.